Hello, and welcome to our session today on succession planning. We'll be talking about searching out the culture that matches your objectives so you can do a good job of grabbing where your company is, finding the right person to fit it, and doing all that it takes to make sure that your company continues to succeed after what we all know is one of the most difficult and traumatic events potentially for an employee-owned company or any company to go through. I'm Lauren Rogers, and I'm delighted to be speaking today with Roger Reiber. We're going to hear about his experiences as the CEO of Winding and his approach to finding his successor at Windings. I'll let Roger talk a little bit more about that whole process, of course, and I'm sure he'll say some of the reasons that we're such fans of Windings here at the NCEO. But before we get into that, let me just briefly talk to you about some of the requirements to get continuing education if you are joining us virtually. In order to get continuing education credit, you need to do three things. You need to be signed into our virtual platform. You need to be using your email when you registered with the virtual platform. We'll have three polling questions that come up at different parts of this presentation, and you'll want to fill out each of those. There are no right or wrong answers. This is just to demonstrate that you are an active participant. The third thing you'll need to do is submit that continuing education survey after the session has wrapped up. Do all those things, and we'll have a certificate good to use for continuing education purposes delivered to you as soon as we can at the end of the conference. So, without any further ado, let me turn this over to you, Roger. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today to talk a little bit about Windings and your experience and to tell people what it takes to do a good quality job of succession planning.
Well, thank you, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I could not ask for a better partner, I think, in terms of the knowledge of ESOPs. And you and Corey, I think, have figured this out in terms of succession. I've been very impressed with the fact that I initially, many years ago, worked with Corey on what an ESOP was and talking to what I thought were smart people about how to create one. And I think now that just observe from the outside, you guys have figured out succession, and you are following Corey's lead and but also including him. And I've been impressed with your the ease of which you have moved, or your organization has moved from Corey's leadership to yours. So I think you are very well qualified to lead and comment on this discussion. So,
Oh,
but
thank you,
anyway,
Roger.
thanks for
Yeah.
asking me. I'm a ESOP disciple. Uh, I bought the company in 1983, and we operated for 25 years. And at about 10 years before I retired, we formed an ESOP. I understood that um, I was not going to live forever. If I could have, I would have stayed doing what I was doing because I loved the excitement of running a small business, and I had a great run at it. But all good things come to an end, and I thought I do believe in planning and setting out a path to make that transition for the good of me, my family, and my employees was very important to me. So I started about 10 years before I actually retired, and we were up and running. And I might also add, I'm certainly away from the company at this point, but all reports are that it's succeeding even better than when I was in charge. And I really believe I'm happy for that. Our I want my legacy to be that the company goes on, and the quasi promises, if you will, that I made about retirement benefits come to pass. And I'm getting feedback from my old friends who are retiring and smiling. So I'm very happy with the whole experience, and the succession is working, and they're going on to bigger and better things. So anyway, to those who might be listening today, I understand that you may have made a decision to form an ESOP. Congratulations. It is an important life decision, and I believe you've made the right one. But it's more than a legal document. It's more than a transaction that your trustees will caution you about and scare you that you must have them on board. It's more in that you need to think about how that your company is going to proceed into the future, not just from a legal standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint as well. I am going to address the cultural issues more today, but of course I cannot ignore the traditional requirements for selecting and naming future leadership and board members. This entity must proceed to be successful. You're not going to take a failing company and turn it into a successful ESOP. So I'm suggesting that and assuming that you are knowledgeable about the business that you're in, the knowledge of the tribal knowledge, the awareness of the industry, and how long you've been at it, and the kind of culture that you have created. Now you can attempt to create or pass on the same culture, or you can also choose to go in a different direction. But you will have a workplace culture, whether you take any action or not. And therefore, I recommend that you think about it and make a decision as to what you hope for your legacy, for your company's culture as it marches off into the future. The interviewing, whether you're looking at next generation from internal or from external, you have to spend time to get a sense of the candidate's commitment to a specific culture. I think that that's extremely important, that you get to know these people, because sometimes it's very difficult to give a test and determine what their attitude about culture is. But I think you'll know it when you see it. You need to be willing to invest the time and the commitment to consider culture as you make this important decision. So, question is, how do you find the right person to carry on the torch? That's something that most of us former owners are interested in. We made this decision for some specific reasons. We have some goals, some motivation, and often I think that the goal is to have the company continue into the future and satisfy the needs of the current employees' retirement needs. I think if with a little bit of study, you can understand that it's for the average employee, retiring on Social Security is not a very pleasant situation. And this opportunity to own a piece of the rock and have a piece of a company that you've helped build is not only satisfying, but is very financially effective. So, what are we looking for? There are different avenues, different types of workplace cultures, and the Harvard Business School has outlined I don't know, 4 or 6 different cultures that I wanted to just summarize on the next slide. There's the one is caring. This is you read about these cultures from time to time with big companies that do a good job at this. And one is caring, with warm, sincere, rational, with an emphasis on mutual trust. Employees are united by the loyalty, the leader's emphasis on teamwork and positive relationships. Now, who can be against that? That's certainly an admirable target, as well as characteristic of purpose, of idealistic, tolerant, a focus on doing good in the long run, long term, the world, sustainability, and global community are core values. Another option are results, hard-nosed, achievement-driven, goal-focused, with the emphasis on winning. Workplaces are outcomes-oriented and merit-based. Employees focus on capability and success. Referred to earlier, your company's still got to be successful, and you have to make the right choices that sometimes seem stiff and hard, but those things have to be addressed. But they can be combined with the culture that softens that and makes allow people to feel good about what they're doing. On the other side, you can choose authority. Authority is the bold, decisive, emphasizing competition and personal advantages. Leaders place high value on confidence and dominance. Now, that's not one that appeals to me a lot, but it is an option that some take because of their strong feeling of creating the success. Another cultural characteristic is safety. Realistic, more conservative, careful, cautious. Employees value being protected and are being able to anticipate changes. Leader emphasizes planning ahead. And lastly, order, rule abiding, respectful, cooperative, with an emphasis on shared norms. Employees seek to play by the rules, fit in, focus on shared procedures, and time-honored customs.
Roger, that's all right. Could I ask you about how those 6 characteristics fit with you and Windings? And I know the transition to Heather has been something that turned out really well for Windings. Would you say that you and Heather are similar on these 6 characteristics, or are there some differences?
Well, of course, there are some differences. I respect Heather. I'm very happy that Heather is there, and she's doing a great job. And there are the caring attitude, the willingness to share, the recognition of our employees as true partners. I sense that is strong. Which one that falls into, I'm not sure. It's hard to place all. We're all a combination of these things, and I like to hear about their crew meetings and the explanation of how the business is going and what Heather's frustrations are. And honestly, I mean, being very honest with the folks, as I call them, our employees. You need to be reinforcing the good things, and you need to be honest with the things that aren't going so well. And those are important. But on top of this culture, the characteristics that the Harvard Business School have defined, I've added another category that I call ownership culture. And that's the characteristics of that are described next on as more common, down-to-earth activities. In addition to the formal ones that we've just spoken about, the ownership culture includes aligning the interests of management and workers. We need to be consistent. We need to be open about what our goals are, who we are, what our mission is. And we as leaders need to acknowledge and accept the employee owners as a vital part of this entity and consider their interests as well as ours as managers. We need to support a meaningful ownership stake for the employees. We truly need to include them as owning a piece of the rock and consider their needs as well as the needs of the leadership. One thing that I was frustrated with throughout my career was the lack of the knowledge and education of the employees about business. What causes us to be successful? What causes us to fail? We need to commit to education of our workforce as to how they can make a difference. You go into a group of people who say, yeah, I'm all in. Tell me what to do. Well, I've said we need to figure out together what to do, and you need to learn about business. I tell the story often, it's probably old, but the first time I was in a crew meeting and one of our factory employees raised their hand and said, what is gross margin? Wow. That was a big day for me. It's a simple question, but it told me that they got the message that they need to understand the language that I'm using when I'm talking about our success or lack of success. And so, but you just don't get up in front and spout out the definition and that is absorbed. You have to take the time to spend with the employees to explain what the income statement means, what the expenses are, what can they affect. You know, we're all for quality, we're all for low rework, but they have to understand that those are real things that flow into the system and into the income statement and create the results that the evaluators look at the end of the year to determine the value of your shares. And so committing time and resources to education, I felt is really important. And this includes sharing the data on a monthly basis and quarterly basis. It's kind of like opening your kimono. Sometimes this is not fun, but it's necessary to be honest. When things are going well, they need to be recognized, and when they're not going well, they need to be explained. So having the confidence and the belief that these people are worthy of sharing this information is very important. And I think we all know that the retirement plan is the focus of our ESOP, and that comes at the end of your career. We need to recognize that these employees have needs as they're working as well. And so building in, acknowledging, setting up a cash bonus plan to go along with, I think, with the ESOP contribution is important. We just can't put our head in the sand and say, well, you'll get yours at the end when you retire. We need to acknowledge that there's a need to have some sharing along the way. And this sharing thing is sometimes difficult. Owners in the future and the past, feel very strongly that they've contributed to this success and that they have earned this reward. Well, if you can't free that up and accept the fact that these employees have contributed and are owed a portion of this, you may be going down the wrong road. And so the sooner you realize that, the better you're off. But for this to really work, you have to have an attitude of sharing and be happy about it, not regret it. I think my last comment on that culture of ownership was the fact of involving the people. Now, we all know the people, the employees, owners do not make the decisions, the final decisions. We hire management to do that. And that's one of the things, we always joke about. Well, now we got an ESOP, we can all vote to fire Fred. Well, that doesn't work. But we need to have the attitude of involving them, asking them, and listening to their input about current everyday problems. It's amazing. Somebody closest to the situation often has some very good ideas. So that's part of the ownership culture that think that is really, really important.
Roger, let me
So,
ask about that just in the context of this conversation about succession planning. I think that idea about engagement is something I've heard you talk about before. I've heard Heather talk about it. What about the role of employee engagement in succession? Did the people at Windings have a role in choosing who was going to succeed you?
I have to be honest with you and say no. I felt quite connected to the people at Windings, and right or wrong, I assumed what was important to them and what was crucial. And I have to admit that decision was at the leadership level and the board level. We've not talked about the board here, but I do think that it's important to consider that when we are independent entrepreneurs running and starting our business, we make all the decisions, and we take responsibility for them, and either we're happy or we're sad. But when you form an ESOP, I think it's important to bring in outside input and to bring in an outside board of directors that is not management salted, if you will. And this is where you can get a lot of input if the board members take the time to interact with employees on a regular basis. They pick up a sense. If you've chosen the right board members with the right attitude about culture, they're going to want to know the employees and will represent them, if you will, as they do in the company. So, got to be honest, I have to say that was a decision that I felt was very important and one that I was prepared to make with not ignoring the needs of the employees, but feeling that I was fully aware of what was important. So anyway, ownership culture is very important. It's not just the perks that you relate to culture of free food and happy games and that type of thing, but truly having a sense of and a feel for these employee owners extremely important on the board's part as well as the next leadership. So that's kind of my pitch. I did go through it, and I'm happy to say that our company is succeeding and going forward. And I don't know the specifics, but I think that the folks that are retiring at this point are very pleased with the fact that we are a 100% employee-owned company.
Roger, just so we've got this for people wondering about the winding story, when was it that the transition happened from you to Heather?
Well, we formed the ESOP in 1998, and it took me 10 years. I noticed on your slide you've said the lead time, it takes 10 years to make transition. Well, I didn't know it at the time, but that's what it took me. I knew I wanted to do this 10 years before I retired at the end of 2008 from the CEO's role and sold the last bit of stock that I had. So it did take 10 years, and I'm not ashamed of that. I think it was a good investment, and we had an interim. We've had two steps here. When I retired, Jerry Kaufman assumed the role of CEO for the next 5 years or so, and then Heather was the CFO, and she moved into that role and is still in the role of CEO. And I think it's they we've I like to think we've all contributed. Myself, from the 1983 when I acquired the company through my involvement in 25 years, where we grew from excuse my a little advertising, grew from nothing to $25 million company, and I might say a profitable company as well. I'm very proud of that and happy that it's happened, and now it's gone on. I was able to figure out a way through your guys' model here to retire, uh, spread out my whole worth was in windings, and we were able to diversify for my family's sake. We were able to solidify Winding's existence in Noel, Minnesota, which, by the way, they've just acquired or recently acquired a 70,000 square foot plant, and that, it's pretty sure they're in Noel, Minnesota for the long term.
Hmm.
And and our employees are retiring. I'm losing a lot of my old friends that are smiling as they move up north, if you will, to the cabin. Um, so I don't know if I answered your questions. It was a slower process, but at the time I finally made that decision, I was very confident and sure that Jerry was going to go carry on the culture that I had hoped for.
Hmm. Good. So, just one more question, then I'll get to my portion of the presentation,
Sure.
and then we'll have some time for you and I to talk a little bit. So, looking back on it, are you glad you took those 10 years, or do you think you could have shrunk that a little bit? When what looking back, it was 10 years, right?
I think it was. I'm very happy with that, and there was two reasons, and I must admit that part of it was selfish in the fact that I was happy doing what I was doing, leading the company, finding new customers, making profit, and each year we grew and we made our goals. The company became more valuable, and I had no reason to sell in 2000 in 1998 where I was doing what I wanted to do, and each year we were increasing the value of the company. And I have to admit, I the last shares I sold for considerably more than the first shares I sold. And
Hmm.
so that was number one. I don't know if that was number one. I don't think it was number two, but number one was the fact that we were having success in offering the services we were offering. We had a method to finding new customers, and we were being successful. And it's fun to be on a winning team. To be very honest with you, and I didn't feel the need to do something different, and so I chose to stay aboard, but still start the process such that I knew eventually I was mortal. I was not going to last forever, and I had a way, systematic way, to transfer this equity to my good friends and fellow employees.
Great. Good. Thank you, Roger. No, we'll be talking a little bit more at the end of this session. I wanted to make a few other points that I think fit really nicely with what Roger was just talking about. I think you could look at what Roger was saying as a guide to finding the right person to be the CEO. So I'd like to talk about some of the things that go along with that. Some of that, I won't say anything about finding the right CEO, just a little bit about some of the things that go along with it. And that's because a good succession plan changes a lot more than just the person who is the CEO at any given time. I think good way to think about a succession plan is it should start not with finding the new CEO, but a strategic rethink. We should be thinking when it gets to the when we're getting close to thinking about who the new CEO should be. That's a great time for the board, for the executive team to step back and think about, in an ideal world, what would be different about the organization? Should we be diversifying by adding new lines of business, by acquiring businesses? Is there any part of what we're doing that we should spin off? Do we need a a new structure? Do we need a new way of approaching the business? We can think about a lot of these strategic issues, and the person to hire for the CEO is the person who should fit the company's plan, not the person who fits the company's present. And I thought what Roger was saying before when he had the six characteristics of of what a company culture looks like, but according to the Harvard Business Review, it's interesting that he and Heather are the different set of configurations on those six issues, and I think that's how things ought to work. It makes sense for the succession plan to aim for the future, even though it can be natural to think we're hiring a CEO, let's do our very best possible to fill the gap that's going to be left when our current CEO leaves. That's not necessarily the right thing to do. And Roger, you very kindly mentioned the transition from Corey Rosen, who's the founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership and who was the executive director for decades, to me. We changed places in 2011. He's still on staff, very active. But I think anybody who's interacted with both Corey and with me knows that we have really different skill sets. There's a lot of stuff that Corey knows, a lot of things that Corey can do that I will never be able to do. And there are some things I do that are different from the way that he approaches things. So the future of the NCEO had a lot more to do with building out a full organization, a little bit more structure, and that kind of structure was a better fit for someone like me than for someone like Corey, whose natural approach is to be very entrepreneurial, to make decisions, to be a quick actor. So I think under the NCO as things are now, I'd see it as us being entrepreneurial as a whole organization. So,
Hey,
uh,
Lauren, there was
yes,
one
please.
thing that brought to mind here. I mentioned it, but I think I'd like to emphasize it more. The
Sure,
fact
please.
the the decision to bring on to create a board of directors that is external to management, if you will, that you bring in people who have good experience in the industry or in certain areas of expertise, that it is additional input to the leadership. It's really up to the board of directors to set the strategic plan in conjunction with the CEO. But often I think it's risky or it's tempting to put that completely responsibility on the CEO. And I think we're missing out. Many companies are missing out on good input by not taking serious, just walking through the steps of having a board, but not really using it as they could. And so I would just emphasize, take a look, think about it, bring in some smart people that you trust, and then listen to them, because that's the group that ought to set that strategic review that you're talking about and weigh in. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's
Thank you, Roger. Completely agree. And along those lines, a couple of resources that may be useful for any company that is looking at building out its board to get ready for a CEO transition. The NCEO has a board resource toolkit and a candidate directory. If you're at the point where you're interested in doing what Roger just mentioned and bringing in some outside directors to help get your board ready to help for a transition, to help the board do some of that strategic planning, then that toolkit can be a really helpful resource. You can find that in the members resource part of our website. There's also another session that's part of this virtual conference, which is called Strategic Envisioning, and it's by my friend and colleague Dan Adley. And his approach there is to talk about the role of the board in thinking about strategic vision. Okay, actually, before we get to the 10 years before the transition slide, there are a couple of the things I wanted to say about where we want to be in terms of the planning, hiring a CEO for the future. And part of that is definitely the strategy of the organization. Part of it is also the structure. Hiring a CEO, maybe the current CEO has talents as both a visionary leader and is functionally serving as the CFO at the same time, for example. Part of the succession planning might be that the future organization needs both a CFO and a separate CEO. So the succession planning for the CEO might also involve making some structural changes, like adding some other members of the executive team to create a bigger team than the company currently has. Some other pieces that might go into picturing the future of the company are things like thinking about, um, is the company currently meeting its goals in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do you have the diversity, equity, and inclusion represented in your executive ranks that you want to? And there are some things you can do there. One best practice that we've seen a number of companies be really conscious about is to make sure the job description doesn't refer to he. It can be as simple as getting your pronouns right and making sure that you've got people, both men and women, feeling welcome to apply for the job. Also, we've seen a number of our member companies avoid terms like culture fit, and that's something I'm sure many of you listening will have mixed feelings about. It is important, of course, to get a culture fit, but it can also be the kind of thing that invites people to hire people that are more similar to them than different. So let's talk about that 10 years before the transition starts. When you're talking about 10 years before the start of the transition, that comes down to several things: strategy, communications, structure, and governance. We've talked some about strategy. We've also talked about setting up some of the pieces that go along with strategy. That might include having the board set some explicit goals. Those should be measurable goals for what they'd like the company to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, so that not only do you have some measurable goals toward which you're hiring a CEO, but you've got something in place to use to judge the success of the new CEO. In terms of communication, we've seen a number of boards, whether or not they have a role for employees in the transition, be very clear about how they communicate the succession process. They set up a very clear communications process with a timeline. Some of them set up a decision making grid saying, what are the steps in our succession process and who's doing which of those steps? It's a good way to give people a clear insight into what's actually happening with the succession process and if it's on track. And even if people don't have a role themselves in managing the succession, something like a decision grid can go a long way to making them feel comfortable through one of the scariest things that an organization does: finding a new CEO. One thing we've seen a number of uh, boards do is that structure rethink, and I think it's wise to have, as Roger mentioned, to have some outsiders on the board, so that you've got the perspective to to step back a bit and think about whether everybody ought to, whether there should be a change in structure at the same time that we're doing this CEO transition. So I mentioned the board toolkit. That the toolkit can help you find some directors. It also has some guidance on how you might want to approach some of the best practices in a CEO transition. If you are the member of a board of directors listening to me and Roger now, picking the right successor for your current CEO is the most important thing you do. It's your primary role as a member of the board is oversight of the company, and that oversight of the company all focuses on the CEO.
Strategic planning and succession are those two main things.
Good. Thank you, Roger. All right. Let's go to that next slide, which is everybody in the role has everybody at the company has a role in transition. Now, you can look at that a lot of different ways. Companies do all sorts of different things. Roger's talked about the approach at Windings. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the maximum approach to giving people a role in the transition. And you, of course, need to do what feels most comfortable, what's the best culture fit for you and your business. But I'd suggest that some of our member companies have found a role, an explicit role, maybe a small, for everybody at the company in putting together the transition to a new CEO. Some of that can be a role in the prep work. We have a number of member companies that do some form of high involvement strategic planning, where the board and the executives still drive the strategic planning process, but there's a role for answering some specific questions, gathering input, and reflecting back on a draft of the strategic plan that non management employees also get involved in. Having that set up early in the process, that's part of that 10 years ahead of time, can make sure that everybody's bought into the strategic plan so that when the board is exercising its role in helping find the next CEO, everybody's bought into the criteria that they're looking at when they're finding a CEO.
Lauren, I think this is a good point to make is that every employee may not be having their thoughts heard by the board, but the fact that the employees believe that the board has a systematic way to do this evaluation is encouraging. The fact is that they realize that they're perhaps not in a position, they haven't had the experiences and know the industry well enough to make those decisions, but to know that those things are being considered gives you confidence that this future is brighter because they're doing this rather than a knee jerk, let's go this way. If they've actually taken a systematic approach to it, is encouraging, and that's part of trusting the employees with that knowledge.
Yep. Yeah, I agree, Roger. The role in the transition for an employee might simply be to do what you just said, to be the consumer of information that the board provides about where they are in the process, and
Hmm.
that's a legitimate way to approach a transition as well. Some of our members do take a larger role for employees. We've had some organizations set up a process where there's an interview process that involves some non-management employees in the in the interview process. There might be a group interview. Something that we at the NCEO do is we're smaller than many of the people listening now, but when we get to the point of having a final round interview, we have everybody on staff invited to a meeting to meet our candidates for roles in general. Now that's an investment of staff time. We found it to be really useful in having everybody feel bought into the success of new employees. And that can be really valuable for any role at a business, and certainly for the CEO. Um, so another thing we've seen some companies do is beyond the employees to involve other people connected with the organization, and that includes vendors, core customers. We've seen companies be pretty broad in how they include people into the program. So one role for employees that we've seen a number of our member companies do, it's pretty informal, is when they do have some of these broad-based interviews that involve a lot of people at the business. They they have an opportunity for the board to systematically solicit red flag input from anybody on staff. And what I mean by red flag input is it's just a point for anybody to raise an issue that they wondered if it would be a red flag for the person's ability to succeed as the new CEO. Now, that doesn't mean that person has a veto power. It just means that they have an issue that they are going to get in front of the board, and the board commits to taking that into account. Um, we at our I'll speak again from the NCO's experience. We had a one person interview There were two people on our entire staff who had a red flag concern about them. And I was really glad in hindsight that we listened to them. It turned out to be the right thing. And it wouldn't have occurred to us if we had had a smaller group of people involved in that interview process. So, uh, one other piece that's important when it comes to everybody having a role in the transition, if that's the way you choose to go, one benefit of it is that it does a lot to uh, get ahead of rumors. Uh, Everybody knows that there's a possibility of people getting worried when they know that an executive transition is going to happen. It can be the most scary thing that happens at the company. People see it not only as a threat to the company, but a sign that the company might be in trouble. So giving people a clearer role, both in as being recipients of information about how the succession process is going, and if you choose to, having a role in providing input into the succession can be really valuable in terms of heading off some of those rumors and keeping people from being more worried about how the company is doing. I know many of you who are listening now have ESOP communication committees. This can be a great role for them to have them be a source of both communication to your workforce about how the succession is going and an opportunity for the workforce to have a role in communicating back about succession planning um, and how it's going. Okay, the next topic I wanted to cover is about what happens after the CEO starts. It The succession plan does not stop on that date. On the date that the new CEO starts work, they should already be in plan in place about how the onboarding is going to work. There should be frequent check-ins with the chair of the board. I meet with the chair of my board every 2 weeks. That you might want to do that more often in the early years or early months, especially after a new CEO starts. We like to have a 3 month and a 6 month very scheduled review process for new employees at the NCEO, and that can be a very useful thing for the board to do with a new CEO. Of course, there's a difficult balance here. You don't want to stifle or micromanage the CEO, so this is not about second guessing how she or he is doing the work. It's about making sure that the board is doing an appropriate role of monitoring the CEO and how everything is going. Now, one other part of that, and Roger, I'd love your input on this, is the succession plan for the new CEO should also include some thoughts about the role for the former CEO. We often assume that the natural role for the former CEO of a business is to be on the board, perhaps to be the board chair, but that's not necessarily the case. Yet in some companies, the CEO does step into the board or the board chair role. In others, the CEO steps into that role for as long as, let's say, a seller note is being held, a seller note that the CEO may hold. But other companies have made a conscious decision to make a sharp break and have the former CEO no longer be on the board. Roger, what was your perspective on that? What was your role at Windings the day after the after you left as CEO?
Well, to be very honest, it wasn't drastic. It wasn't a lot different. I had been moving responsibility, day-to-day responsibility to other people, Jerry specifically. And so I spent more time doing the things I wanted to do and enjoyed doing was out amongst the employee owners, getting their input directly and listening and also encouraging the succession managers to do the same, to get out and listen to people. Often we I think incorrectly see that as a waste of time to get out and walk through the plant and talk with people. And I disagree completely. I think you build this culture by eyeball to eyeball, and you have to be willing to take the time, listen, and respond honestly. You know, sometimes there's things that that you don't agree with. But I've found that people respect your willingness to come and listen to their situation, even if what you have to tell them is not pleasant. So,
Mhm.
my answer to your question is that I was officially 10 years, but I did serve on the board for, I forget now, either 4 or 5 years subsequent to my retirement as a CEO. And I hope I contributed. I tried my best. I understand not the requirement not to meddle in current management's. I never, after I left the CEO's job, I never answered the question directly from the employee on the floor. I
Mhm.
always referred them to the current CEO. But I think that I led the way in telling them that they're respected and they're listened to, and that I would do my best to represent what they told me to the current management, but that I was no longer management. You got
Mhm.
to be clear about that. You can't be a partial boss. You either need to be the boss or you're not. And
Yeah.
I think I understood that, and I'm very happy the way that sometimes they didn't do what that I hoped they would to do, to be very honest. And I
Mhm.
felt bad about that for a little while, but I got over it. And I think
Mhm.
overall they've made good decisions. And I'm glad that I decided to retire as I did. I know it was an advantage from a financial standpoint because the company grew substantially in those 10 years, and it increased in value.
Mhm.
And I'm just thankful for the opportunity that this model gave me to do that.
Great. All right. I have one more slide and then we'll have a little bit of time for a couple questions. So, succession planning isn't just about CEOs. One of the smart things we've seen a number of our companies do is also do succession planning, not just for other executives, but throughout their entire business. The idea is to get everybody at the business to start thinking about who would take their place if, well, we used to say the bus test. Let's
By the
say
truck.
if they won the lottery. Um, so I think it's especially important to do that for key employees, but it's a good exercise for everybody. It's a good way to think about not just getting people to fully document what they do, so that the business will have minimal impact if they do need to leave, but it's also a way to give people a sense for their career progression. If I know it's possible for someone to take my job, if I've thought about that, and I know that everybody else at the company is doing that, then it gives me a reason to feel like there's real growth potential here for me. We're all talking about what it would take for people to move up and take a new position. And I think in a lot of ways, especially right now during this great resignation, the prospect of a growing, thriving career is really essential to keep people excited about remaining at your workplace. So, succession planning for your whole workforce can be one of the tools that you've got to keep down retention, to give people a more reason to stay. I think it's also good in a similar way to try to make sure that your key stakeholders, your vendors, customers, people like that, have a real sense of as many of people as possible at your business. One way to look at this whole question is to ask yourself, who's essential to your business? Everybody. Who wants to know what's coming, what the future holds? Everybody. To the extent that the answer to those two questions really is everybody, then everybody ought to be thinking about succession planning. Okay, that's the end of the points I wanted to be sure that we covered. So that succession planning is about a lot more than who the CEO is. It's about the future of the organization that we're trying to create. It starts 10 years ahead and involves conversations about structure, strategy, communications, and governance. It's about everybody in the company potentially having a role and potentially everybody in the company actually doing their own strategic planning. So there are a bunch of questions that come up about strategic planning. We've talked about them a little bit, but Roger, I wanted to ask you a question. Did you use a recruiter when you were thinking about who was going to take your place? And if not, why not?
I did not. I did not use a recruiter. I have perhaps uh, an extra dose of self-confidence, but I felt very, very comfortable in evaluating the folks that were potential next leaders, and I felt comfortable in making that decision. I did not hesitate, and I did not spend the extra fees involved in doing that, and made the decision myself. And could it be better? It could have been better. It could have been smoother. But in the end, I'm not unhappy with the results.
Okay. And is that what you would recommend to somebody else in your situation now?
Well, it depends on how close you are to the situation. There are owners that are really into it. I felt very close to the business and the people and the characteristic, the culture that existed, and that gave me confidence that we could continue the legacy that we had started in 25 years ago. And I just didn't have doubts. Now, if I were less experienced and had not the degree of success that we had, I might have been more willing to seek out help. But I found that often you can seek out, you can ask questions of smart people, and they will voluntarily contribute to your situation. You don't have to hire a consultant at every turn. So I that's just my conservative bent.
Yeah. Nope.
But
Understood.
I want to leave a tagline here before we leave. We win, you win. The way for me to win in my retirement is for the company to be successful. And I want to do everything. I want to encourage you to do everything you possibly can to contribute to making this organization successful, to continue to grow, to serve customers, and to be profitable. That will ensure maximum return for you, the employee.
Good. I like that. We win, you win. It's all of our interests are aligned, and
Are aligned.
that's the special sauce of employee ownership.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Let me ask you one other question, Roger. I know we've seen a fair number of times that a company needs to do leadership succession quickly. Maybe something external happened, a medical issue or some family emergency. Do you have any advice for people that need to do succession more quickly than the 10 years you were able to take?
Well, uh, again, I learned I tend to talk and quiz smart people. I would go to somebody who's been through this recently and ask the questions you're asking here. How did you do it? Would you do it over? Would you do it differently? Whose advice would you seek? I'm there. The ESOP community has grown so much over the last 25 years that there are many more people available, I think, to that you folks can reference a newbie to get some very good advice. So I guess I would talk to people that have been through this and ask them to be very candid and listen to them.
Well, thank you, Roger. And yes, the NCO is more than happy to help if we can be useful with you in either thinking about a succession plan, how to process it, how to get board members that might be able to smooth the process. We love getting calls from you, so thank you for participating in today's programs. Please do give us a call if we can be helpful. I want to thank all of you and Roger. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad that I could do it. I really believe in the NCEO and I believe in ESOPs completely, and it's a
Mhm.
wonderful model. And I would really encourage anybody to consider that. And I'm one of those old timers that have been through the war, and survived it. And I'm very willing to talk to anybody who has a question about what my experience has been.
Roger, thank you. That's generous of you. You've presented at conferences a number of times, and it's been really valuable. I know for the people who have heard your story. So thank you for all you've done in the past, all for this presentation, and really, I think the most important thing any of us can do is build successful, compelling employee-owned businesses, and you've been integral to creating one of the most successful, most exciting companies I know. Windings is a great example of a company, and I know you and everybody you work with and worked with are proud.
Well, I just say thank you for teaching an old dog new tricks. I've never done a recording like this before, and here I am on TV. So I appreciate you and you and Jamie's patience with me. I hope that I've contributed.
You absolutely have, and you're a natural, Roger. All right. I echo the thanks to Jamie. Jamie, thanks for making all this happen. And Roger, thank you.
Thank you.